Hello and welcome to the Awaken with Shadow Work podcast. My name is Caroline Reilly and today I'm joined by Michael Tsarion. How are you doing, Michael?
Great, Caroline. Thanks for the invitations. Appreciated.
Well, thank you for coming on. First of all, I need to say another thank you for all the hard work that you've done over the years, because your work has kind of led me down this journey of shadow work and has really kind of changed my life and improved it immensely. And it's not just me, it's also the other members on the Awaken with Shadow Work group have also expressed their thanks. So I just want to start with that.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, I know I've been following your thread and social media, and of course the poster is phenomenal, as are the comments from people watching. So big thanks to that. It's sorely needed. But again, thanks a lot for the personal invitation. There's so much to go into, so much to talk about with this. It's really important that people like yourself do this. But again, to an advanced stage, I think we're way past the pop level, with the new age stuff, and it's time to delve in a little bit more deeper. We do that on Enslaved, and I know you do it, so I'm really, really thankful for that.
So you've had some really brilliant podcasts recently. You've had Women and the Unconscious, Killing the Shadow, the New Age Movement, Fraud, Angels and Archetypes, and you've also done a lot of work on the Dragon Mother series. So in one of those, you mentioned, you've described the shadow as a holy place, also as a transformer, and also as an irritant. I wondered if you could just elaborate on some of those.
Well, it's all of those things, isn't it?
Yeah.
The shadow is important to Jung. I think it's so important now. It really is. It's become a buzzword. I know we talked about that before. That's inevitable, because any subculture, whether it's the New Age movement or some alt research community, they're going to borrow terms, not really knowing even less than a footnote. Most of them know. They don't even know the real classic definition, and yet you see this word shadow work turning up everywhere. It's used, but we kind of accept that, because all subcultures borrow from authentic teachings and authentic teachers, sort of as a pretense, to act like they know what they're talking about, to make it look like they're in touch. And that's going to happen. There's no way getting around that. But all best we can do is to try and, flesh it out. And one of the ways is exactly what you said, and that's to remind people, look, when you're talking psychology, you're not talking sociology, you're not talking politics. It's a very specific area, and there's so much can be said about why psychology, psychoanalysis is different than philosophy, different than science. It is in many core ways. With the additions of Carl Jung, it becomes even more unique. It has parallels only then to some sort of German mysticism, some sort of, shamanism perhaps, alchemy, tarot, astrology. It starts to have similarities with more of a mystic tradition, which is great. I have no problem with that. But this is what then I would talk about when I say that it's holy work. But, even for somebody who can't grasp that on the level that probably, one means it in the deepest sense, let's just understand that any kind of dialogue with oneself, right? Just to make it, so simple, right? Any concept of thoughts in your head, you having this daily dialogue with yourself, forget about Jung, levels of investigation into the deeper psyche and the unconscious. Look, holy work is your conversation with yourself. It is your capacity to introspect. You talk to yourself in the street now, it is a classic bona fide sign of madness. Not saying that facetiously. It will turn up in some manual where they can come with the butterfly nets. But you won't need them. The family will have already knocked it on the head. Your workmates will think you're crazy.
Yeah. It's
lampooned. It's a source of joke. It's comedy. Why? There's cultures where if you don't do it, you're considered crazy. Yeah. In fact, in the Middle Ages, when people spoke to themselves, it was considered completely natural. Later on, it was like a sign of schizophrenia. The great poet Tennyson used to go on long walks in southern England, around the estates and the village, and people would hear him speaking to himself and even reciting his own name as a mantra. This is an absolute fact. And he's poet laureate. So, it's such a bizarre thing how it's faded from concern, And again, even religion has co-opted it, with the prayer, let's say, right? Look, religion be damned. It's the self-conversation. You can't co-opt it. It's a natural psychological fact. And that's holy work. And then from that point, I could expand it into psychoanalysis, the deeper shamanic work with the unconscious, whatever. I would say personalism. You know, I'm a personalist. I've written books about that subject. And all that is just an extension of this normal fact that people dialogue with oneself. And personalism is just then that taken to a much more sophisticated, higher level, which involves much deeper levels of privacy, of course, you know, but that's a little bit topical. That's more obvious. Personalism is actually a deepening, right, of that self-dialogue, you know. And in the mystical tradition, it was known as Dasein. You know, it's a word that has many meanings, but Dasein was the mystical tradition of keeping it private, keeping it hermetic. That's why it's called the Hermetic tradition, right? Hermetic being quite obviously internalized, where Sosign is its opposite, and that became religion, non-mystical teachings. So one could unpack that endlessly, you know.
Yeah, I was just telling you that I lived in Ireland for a while, and when I first started doing my shadow work, I'd take my dogs on very long walks, and in Ireland, you know, there's not very many people over there. It's very, very quiet. And I would talk to the sky, and I would talk to the trees. And this was like the first time that I'd ever done it. And then I started in my car. I couldn't wait for everyone to get out of my car so that I could talk to myself.
Right.
And I found that it was I don't know what the feeling is, but there's a real kind of coming home to yourself when you do something like that. It's just you talking with you. It's something that's very sort of personal. And I think that it's very important. I'm glad you brought it up, because it is something that's very important in shadow work, I think, is to build that in the dialogue. It's
important to teach it to children, not make them, you know, feel a stigma with it, because children have their own, what's the term for it? They're magical friends.
Yeah.
You know, and that's knocked on the head real early, right? Which is to do with the twin and the self, the double. These things are ancient. They were legitimized by ancient societies. They're certainly not legitimized today. And like I said, the holy work just starts there. I mean, you're not using it will. This is a natural phenomena of what it means to be a being, is to have that self-conversation. And then all the different, you know, aberrations of it. Like when we do end up trying to, it's important for other people to know me. I don't feel good unless I know they know me. Whoever told you that? Nobody can know you, just in the same way you can't know anybody else. Where did you start with that? Well, school, parents, right? The whole thing gets derailed. But yeah, the holy work starts with your communion with self. Autolog, look it up. Autolog. Mm-hmm. Communication with self, and then find out how that has led to all the other things, and how it eventually leads even to schizophrenia, you see, when the whole system breaks down. Mm-hmm. And yet these underpinnings of psychology are not taught. Psychology itself is nothing but education, primary education into knowing yourself. Remember, like it says on Delphi, know thyself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, is good enough for the Greek sages, the Orphics, the Vedics, the pre-Vedics. And it hasn't changed today. Why should it? Finding out about one's own mind and behavior, does that sound bizarre to anybody? It's the basis of all knowledge, right? Self-knowledge must come before I can know anybody else. How can I possibly know anybody else or even think of doing that unless I have at least a modicum of self-knowledge? Well, see, what's happening in our society today is that we don't have the self-knowledge, then we don't have the Hegelian knowledge of the other, and then we don't have society. Society literally breaks down the glue, which is sacrosanct, which cannot be melted by any other force, right? It immediately dissolves when self-knowledge is missing. That suddenly the infrastructure, you know, of the Mitwelt, which is society, now starts to show weakness and get metal fatigue. And everyone's screaming about it, but not knowing these underpinnings. Everybody, Dinesh Souza, everybody's got their, you know, iteration or explanation. But until we come back to absolute pure psychology, you're never going to explain why things are coming undone. Something that should be so powerful. Culture, people coming together, societies. Why is it all fading and falling apart? Well, you don't want to look at psychology, then don't, you know, when it all comes down crashing around your ears, don't say you weren't told. The people today have no interest in self-knowledge. They have interest in the crowd, these crusading memes, these talismanic terms, the noise of politics. But you can't turn to a crowd and say, how do you feel? You know, what's your experience of life? There's only the existential questions that matter can only be answered by individuals and even asked to an individual. The more and more we subject ourselves to the crowd, the less and less any existential or psychologically valid question becomes null and void. You can't even ask it. How can you ask a crowd how they feel? Or how do you feel as if you're talking to an individual? I mean, come on. The whole thing is bankrupt.
You mentioned the regressive society, feminized society. What do you think about shadow work being an antidote for regressive society? Do you think that that's right? I mean, what I mean by that is, if people did their shadow work, would we still have this regressive society? Is my question.
Oh, no, because remember, you're opening up communion with guides. See, when you're talking shadow, as you well know, it's an archetype. So it's a little bit deeper than what we just said. The inner dialogue, the basic 101. Oh, well, there's an unconscious, a preconscious, and an ego, or an id, and a superego, and an ego ideal. That's all just 101 stuff. What you're talking about now is holy work. It's a far deeper. Now, as a matter of fact, it doesn't, you asked about will when we talked before. It's not really an active will. Or will is part of it, right? But this is already going on. Shadow work is already going on. It's, in fact, that's why we call it unconscious. It happens when we're not even aware of it.
Yeah.
So the real way to look at it, along, say, lines that Freud and Jung would, okay, you know, if they were critiquing you, they'd say that what all you're doing is become consciously aware of what is going on unconsciously. And this does have roots even back into the philosophers who talk like this as well, right? But again, shifting gears a little bit, don't forget, it is also, when I say it's already ongoing, I mean that is because the whole of modern ego existence, ego consciousness, is itself in a healing sphere, a healing phase from the old ancestral trauma. We don't want to talk about that too much, but I always like to add it in. The first chapters of Dragon Mother had to factor this in, because everything we experience in history is a slow, gradual healing from an old ancestral trauma that, you know, the ego has dissociated from. That's why we have ego defenses. All the psychologists in the world know about ego defenses, but very few of them know what we're talking about. You wouldn't believe why the ego has defenses. It's got defenses for things we can't even fathom, that are not even factored in by most psychology today, not factored in by sociology. And that is that the brain, the mind, the consciousness was severely traumatized by terrestrial, you know, cataclysm and all the rest of it. And Julian Jaynes touched on this, Immanuel Velikovsky, but really it was never delved into that deeply. Mm-hmm. Probably Velikovsky is the best, right? And then bringing it into psychology, you know, it's about a massive seismic trauma that took place. So right, everything that's happened since that trauma, since 3,000 years BC, or, you know, the date is a big argument, right? Let's forget about that. But everything since the birth of Christ, all what we know of consciousness, why religion has arose as a stabilizer, why science, why metaphysics, you know, why even modes of sociology have all arisen, why denial has arisen, why self-deception, why schizophrenia. I mean, this original seedbed of trauma is the soil for all pathology, right? Although later on the pathology takes on bizarre, you know, twists and turns, right? But again, to answer your question, shadow work then becomes the individual's way to deal not only with something ontogenetic, a personal hang-up from his childhood, you know, we'll get to that in a minute, how important those ontogenetic personal traumas are, but this wider seedbed of ancestral trauma, because all later trauma above it, right, later, in other words, in history, if they're constantly traumatized, it's like these little keys, little antenna, little tuning forks. If trauma is constantly, you know, hitting on them, finally by the law of resonance, which is a cosmic law just like gravity or light, is awakening the deeper dragon of trauma below. Now, in fact, our architects of control all know all about this, by the way, the Bernays types and Aldous Huxley types, they know all about this and co-opt this. But even besides that aspect, we don't get free. So shadow work to me is, as Jung said, a deepening look at the, you know, working to see who your archetypes were, which ones are friendly, which ones aren't. And we'll get into all of that in a minute. But it's also with in mind. In other words, I think it's better. I think if you do your shadow work with this in mind, it's actually better. It improves the situation. When you realize that the shadow is not just a personal shadow, it is an ancestral one. All human beings suffered trauma, both you know, in the terrestrial sense and then in the psychological sense. So there's a resonance has been set up. And so this is the character of the shadow. Once you start getting in touch with the shadow, it might have a character that is so utterly bizarre that unless you know what we're talking about now, you'll have a very, very paltry, you know, relationship with it or explanation of it. So there's many dimensions. I try to bring that to bear, you know, these little bit subtleties. But yes, unless you have identified the shadow, you know, it's going to be impossible to heal, either from traumas of your own personal life, which could be very considerable. And all the shadow is rage, really, right? And I think that what needs to be brought out is that it's not that the shadow is an entity. Shadow is a realm. Shadow is a shadow realm into which you've dumped or been forced to dump all of these characteristics that are of the true self. They're all legitimate. This is the most crucial thing to understand. They're not illegitimate, they're legitimate. But a mad, abnormal society, right, and parents addicted to adultism recast your character, your will, and your identity as being negative, as being something, you know, delinquent. And no doubt there is that mixture of delinquent things that we all need to progress. But my idea is that we'll normally progress. You know, by teenage years, there shouldn't be any delinquency. And if there is, that's because something went wrong even in the previous Oedipus complex, because those 7 years are a microcosm of 700 years. And then the period in the womb is like 700 years as well. So one has to see it that way. But again, without getting into all those digressions, the idea is that you've got to process these darker emotions, right? One of which is anger and rage, anger, whatever, right? But there's also guilt and shame and all of these other things involved in there. And they're all legitimate, but they're all censored by those ego defenses again. And they're all housed in the right brain. And then finally in the body, we'll hopefully get into that thing today about the Reichian approach to all of this shadow work. Because I'm a real disciple, not so much of Jung's description of shadow work, I certainly am, and Erich Newman, but my God, right? There's a whole other thing that I bring to bear, which is the Reichian definition. I know he never used the word shadow work explicitly. Everything he's talking about pertains to Jungian shadow work in the sense of how do I then access these darker emotions, which my society forbids me, which my parents forbid me. How do I get in touch with those? And this is where dream work and everything comes in, we were talking about before. But just to always fill that background in of the age of catastrophe, I think is essential as well.
Brilliant. Can you tell us about individuation, what it means to become individuated?
Yeah, because that's the opposite of habituation. When we're talking about collective factors and growing up in a culture that's already dictating to you through your parents, what they want to see, what they're going to pin the badge on, to you for is doing as she did, doing as he did. Don't you know your cousin's way smarter than you? She's getting better grades in the school, or that fella kicks a ball better. I mean, why can't you? Look at the way you're dressed. Look at the way your hair is. I mean, look at the interests that you have. We're not interested in any of that. What? Right? So the entrapment is habituations. You'll get the medal for habituating, meaning casting all your individual traits aside, unless you're with enlightened parents who don't ever do this. But there are very few and far between. And then on the little bit higher level, individuation is the work that is holy work. It is the Siddhartha road. It's very difficult work. And for a start, one thing that people miss with this is that individuation, right, is a process. Shadow work is a process. Identifying the shadow it doesn't happen in 24 hours. It's a process that may continue through the whole of life. So this is a missing piece because we're in an instant shrink wrap, drive-through culture, which they think that even some of these psychological things we're talking about are something that you do or you get done. No, it never ends. It's a process. And unless you have that long haul, you have your setting is for the long haul. And that, of course, is very difficult because nobody around you is into that. Nobody's going to accompany you. Everything is immediately dispenser-like. So there's no formula involved here at all. Because once you set about that process, oh my God, these archetypes are going to lead you round and round, up and down, inside out. They're not going by any bloody formula. So this involves the entire process, that's the key word, of self-discovery, right? And that even entails a underworld journey or journeys, plural. I went into this in The Path of the Fool. We went into that in detail. And then even finally, to extrapolate what that underworld journey is in layman's terms, it's just a process of sensitization. So individuation is akin to sensitization, a turning within to know what do I feel and think about all of this. See, the weird thing that our Western society has taught us, the Western tradition, one of the failings of the Western tradition is that, and this was deconstructed by people like Heidegger and Nietzsche and others, but we think that consciousness is a matter of thinking. And that's utterly false. It's not. It has nothing to do with thinking. Thinking is an emanation, a later, derivative emanation, because consciousness is really about feeling, a special kind of inward introspective feeling. And then as that intensified for the human race, intellectuality by the way of the left brain and language articulation became a further extrapolation, right? It's like an emanation of the core, real
So you say feeling, but is it also the same as knowing, like an inner knowing?
Yeah. Knowledge of the heart is how I swallowed the Lubitsch. You know something, even Freud, I'll have to look up this quote while we're talking, that Freud even said this, that it's not a matter just of, intellectual processes. It's an actual act of feeling. So consciousness, I think if this was taught to children, I think if we understood this, it would change everything. Consciousness as we know it, right, is all about feeling. And only on a secondary derivative level does now come process of thinking, process of articulation, because it's a way of saying, this is such an intense experience. Another process of trying to verbalize it, first through poetry, then through music, and then through utterance, to share it with the other, to see if the same process is something they've experienced and vice versa, right? But it's all later. It's all later. That's why the Hermetic symbol was this. Go back to Hippocrates, go back to the Hermetic tradition. Go back to the phi ratio. The symbol is a circle with a straight line. That's about quiet. It's about he who speaks does not know. He who knows, does not speak. So tremendous Hermetic principles there.
Brilliant. Okay. I get asked very often about how do we start with shadow work. And how do we sort of identify the shadow? I've got my own sort of list of ideas and answers, but can I get your take on that?
Well, the simple take on it is really, well, it's manifold. Let's get that straight. Nobody can give a spinner rack definition of it. But I would certainly say that real shadow work involves the body, right? Okay, so we have a split brain where the left brain is all the ego defenses, right? And that exists primarily because of trauma. It started with the ancestral trauma, so we needed something that was like a sensor, a gasket, a sphincter, to limit it. Otherwise, we were psychotic. And according to Julian Jaynes, we were. He calls it the bicameral period. And the only way that human consciousness during the bicameral period stayed together in some semblance of sanity was because of the instructional voices of the gods, right? We'll get back to that later. This is how religion, sticks around. Okay, so then later on, as things developed and the traumas, years went by and the trauma lessened slightly, this would be like the late Homeric period. All the Jews, the original Judaism, original Christianity, it's like the life of Brian, right? They were all running around traumatized. That's how you get these bat crazy religions worshipping, Moloch or whatever the hell it was, Jehovah. You get all of that because of this trauma that I'm talking about. As things, sort of improved or whatever, the left brain became the instructional voice of the gods and sectioned off that. Then when an individual is born, it's doing the same thing on the ontogenetic level, suppressing those very emotions of rage and shame and self-doubt, you see, and deep criticism. And even according to Melanie Klein, murderous feelings, right, that the child has towards the parents. Go figure, right? I will be doing podcasts galore on that down the line. But this censoring aspect, by pushing things into the right brain, has all the memory of all of that, right? The right brain. And then the body is also then in deep communion with that right brain. So all the ailments of the body through the polyvagal system, we don't want to get into how it's all, the technique of it. It's really through the parasympathetic system. Memorizes, or the Eastern people would say that it's in the meridians, right? It's in the actual nadis. It's in your cellular makeup. Like a Bruce Lipton would say, it's in the cellular makeup of your being. It's right there in the DNA. Is the memory not only of the ancient trauma, but all the physical trauma you've experienced as an individual. Well, what this means is that Wilhelm Reich understood this, that the structure of the body, and you had a question, I know, about chakras and all of that, or one of your members did. See, the way to understand that is not as it's presented in the East. At least for me, it doesn't work at all. Because it involves too much of a concept of higher and lower, and I'm already super suspicious of that. Doesn't mean it's not true, but as far as I'm concerned, any concept of highers and lowers already weakens, right? From an existential, metaphysical point of view, you're already on weird ground there. You're on Gnostic ground and theological, religious ground, which could be completely false, right? Wilhelm Reich's idea was a sort of a dialogue or conversation between energy more in this way, from the core of the body to the surface of the body. Now, in the core and in the surface and in the middle area, all of these traumatic memories are kept in the fibers and meridians of the body. So the way that I would recommend people to get into it, it's a very bizarre recommendation, but I stand by it for many, many decades now. And I certainly wouldn't recommend anything I haven't tried myself or researched. And that is that you must start factoring in the body. And whatever way you want to do that is your own gig, right? It's about getting into physical culture, but I don't mean jogging and weightlifting. I mean Qigong, Tai Chi, Aikido, things like that, or a kind of amalgam, right, of those with Pilates and with various hatha yoga. I'm a big believer in that. Although you got to watch where you go with that. I mean, when I mean hatha yoga, I mean staying within that body culture and not getting into some of the other yogas of the East that could bring a lot of trouble, because they're essentially Gnostic, which is world denying and body denying and all of that. And we don't want to go there, right? But yeah, within hatha yoga, there's some very important practices. But the only thing is that your neighbor can be doing the practice without a clue what we're talking about, unaware for 60 years that it's to do with shadow work. Once you've made that connection, though, oh my God, the whole thing opens up. So even tapping, all of these different things become important now. But Tai Chi, Qigong, the beginning exercises of Aikido, stretching, but you have to do it with a consciousness that this is helping your body release all of that stuff that the left brain simply will not allow you to bring out because of its defenses, unfortunately. So it's preserving authentic feelings. None of this will work until you realize that what is contained in the body, what we call shadow, is authentic and it is legitimate. And you're restoring yourself. If you don't have that firmly within your mind, what's the point of doing it? It's just like, it becomes routine, or it becomes a rote thing. It will, here's that quote I had earlier. Self-knowledge, in Freud's sense, is not an intellectual process alone. It is not only knowledge of the brain, but also knowledge of the heart. Erich Fromm, right? Talking about Freud. So there you have it. But when you go to Grodek, right? When you go to Reich, Lauan, Janov, read those people, read their books. I know that you've been posting brilliant stuff on Reich. On Erich Fromm and others, right? And this is very, very important to realize that even psychology now, even of a quite technical level, by the way, has accepted that the soma, right, is as important as the psyche. And let's just say that it preserves the wisdom that you lost. So the irritant today, the stress, the feeling I'm a half a person, something's missing in life, right? It's right here. It's not out there. It's not in the other coming into your life to change you. It's in this thing that you've been carrying, that you just think is a vehicle. All of the psychic elements are preserved in the body. So that's a long-winded way of saying, come into awareness of the body. It's not knowing, it's awareness. It's a different thing. It's a sense. And when I use the word sensitization, I mean, because you're not dictating to it. You're sensitized to listen to it. There's a different comportment. Instead of going, instead of dictating, right, which is what we do all day long. Now the sensitization is receptivity, in which you're listening to the voices of the archetypes, but the archetypes are also present in terms of your soma. This is the key missing thing. Even a lot of Jungians don't get this yet.
So in terms of archetypes, another question I was going to ask you is, how do you identify the archetypes within our lives? How do they present themselves? Yeah,
that's key. Now, remember that in the podcast we did, I list about, 9 or 10 of them, right? But with the idea that characterologically, your ego is structured around the influence of all, but some are more important, right? So each individual person is going to be sometimes, their ego is going to be constructed, say, by more of the anima. And that's just because of maybe your mother's positive influence or a grandmother or the culture that you grew up in, right? Other people, it'll be animus, right? So right away you see that what we're talking about here is highly based on the culture that you grew up in, right? For instance, your mother and your father, they're stereotypical figures, but they either are going to sync with your archetype or not, right? If your father is a very poor animus figure, animus imago, well, you're screwed, right? If your mother is a really poor anima figure, like she's had a bad relationship with her feminine, or her mother did, or and all of that, you're screwed, right? So, but unfortunately, they're going to be your imagos. So already your archetypal connectivity and your relationship with them is going to be problematic, because if your parents are not psychologically empowered, and are not good imagos, how the hell, right, are you going to have a positive? The only way that you can do that is like, if you go to school and you have a really, really fine teachers or good friends of the family come in, right, or whatever, and in some way you have surrogate figures who kind of straighten this out, right? That would be the first thing. That's on the simplest level. And it can really be important because we have a thing called the image ideal or the ego ideal, which does seek for other imagos other than the parents and other, right? And that can save you. It can save the day. Because a family friend or school friends or the parents of your friend, they might be very important to look up to. You walk into your friend's house and you just like it. We had an old Paddy used to live 3 doors down, and what a fucking mess that house was. It's just like old rollies around, typical old Irish rack, big Victorian ruin. Nothing particularly clean, dog hair everywhere, right? But it smelled good. It's like Tolkien saying, it felt fine. Looks maybe foul, but it felt fine. Where somewhere else you go in and scrubbed clean, plenty of detergent.
It stinks.
Feels fucking foul, right? So it's that. So the archetypes come to you in different forms and they lure you. They go, come over here. They'll seek you out. It's a reciprocal thing, because they're really guardians and they're really guides. And Jung certainly did believe that, And what they really do, though, is that they operate with the will to meaning, right? They are the meaning within you. They're they're the force that try to steer you toward meaning, whereas everything else is will to power. How can you crush the next guy, And the thing to answer your real question, though, is if you're not a feeling type, you're not going to be able to awaken them at all because they don't communicate in words. Like music, if you listen to classical music, or even music with words, it is ultimately the feeling in the song or the tune that is, in fact, there was I think it was is it in China? Or, no, it was Egypt. There's a hieroglyphic for thought. Is the ideogram is actually a heart.
Oh, really?
Fucking nailed what I'm talking about. So thinking is thinking cognition from the outside world in the way that we know, cerebral thought, right? Thinking, when you turn it within in this holy way, becomes synonymous with feeling. And you won't find 1 in a million people who realize that. It is thinking, but in a mythic way, where you're so sensitized now that you're sensing, those other layers, the mythical layer of your Jungs and your Joseph Campbells, and even something deeper, that the Hegels and all we're talking about, a much more deep, mystical flow of Geist, of the spirit's own world. How on earth can you think about that? It's too big for you to think about it, but it's not too big for you to feel, because it's been moving in consciousness from day one. Consciousness, what we call consciousness, is just the most, is the crust. It's the little bud or the blossom on the tree fluttering, but that flutter comes from that twig, that branch, that bough, right? And that trunk, and then those roots, and then there's something below that. What you see at the top is only the epiphenomena. So all of our thinking is really rooted in a deep, deep feeling. Oceanic feeling would be one way to explain it, that Freud used as a term. And he had a problematic relationship with that. Whereas Jung and all didn't. They jumped off and, thanks, that's it. They thought, that's what we really need. And the thinking, that's for the world, that's for stereotypical existence and experience. But when we go down into archetypal existence, it's a matter of feeling all the way, I'd say.
With the archetypes, I want to ask, how are they created? Are they from ancestral memories and life experience? Is it that? Is that what it is?
Yes, and this is extremely important to grasp. Otherwise, you start getting into what I would call, kind of a erroneous mystical ideas, right? Jung was very, very stressed this a lot. And this includes the shadow, of course, right? And that is all content of the unconscious is really based in the same thing as content of the conscious mind, which is daily worldly experience. The only difference is that because mankind has been around for a long time, the impressions and the experiences are registered in the right brain, or the unconscious, if you will, right? Over a longer period of time. Whereas an act of narrowing has to happen when we deal with our memories of our physical, life, obviously. Otherwise, they would just bleed over and you'd be sort of, whatever, schizophrenic or whatever, right? You certainly couldn't function in the way that we do today. A kind of editing and dissociation is natural. I pointed this out when we talked about pathologies in our podcast, is that some of the pathologies are just natural traits of the mind taken off into an extremely inflated or aberrant way. Even dissociation is correct. It's a natural phenomenon, right? Sublation, compensation, all of these are natural things, but they in the wrong society, they get distorted, right? So the unconscious content, all the archetypes, are made up of experiences over time. So the 9 or 10 that I mentioned in Women on the Unconscious, like the hero, the innocent, the warrior, all of this, right? These are based in experience. So the world is our teacher, right? And what this does bizarrely is it makes sensation, right? Which is always considered the weak function or the less important function, because you're thinking, feeling, emotion, and so you're thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation. Mm-hmm. If you really read the Jungian thing correctly, you'll find out that sensation is actually the most important, because it was through sense, senses that we first registered an external world. And when we first came up against, the pleasures and pains of living in the physical world, and we first came up with the idea, here's a mother, here's a father, here's an animal, here's fire, here's the tribe, here's comfort, here's discomfort, here's failure, here's sorrow, here's rivalry, here's anger. So none of this is mystical in that sense, right? In that sense, they're not coming from some supernatural kind of experience, although that's involved in as well, because the self and God archetype, we'd have a different conversation if we went into that. But even those are experiences of the mystery or the beauty of the world. So even the God archetype, and this is why Jung is so important, right? Because it's not that he's tearing up religion with statements like that, but he's certainly set some dynamite on the foundations, just like Nietzsche had done and others had done. Jung is pretty much an iconoclast as well. And that is because he's trying to show you where these supernatural ideas came from in the physical sense. So the scales that come off people's eyes, I mean, I know you know this, but the feeling of, I've just had a squeegee for the third eye, as Bill Hicks said, somebody's poured a bucket of water over my seeing, and finally I'm getting clear on things. This is what I've been waiting for, As I say, it's not to negate the other. You don't throw out anything, but you reconfigure it in the whole. Here's where religion comes in. Here's where metaphysics, from a neutral, from an unbiased historical position, you now surveil what's out there instead of being, fanatically embedded in it, right? You can stand back and have the intellectual understanding of the thing. Oh, now I see where it is. Somebody stood one day, a shepherd on the hill, and as he was doing his mundane work and chopping logs, he suddenly looked up and saw the sunset, or he saw mist on the mountain. And suddenly he's no longer caught in that ontic, stereotypical, mundane action. Suddenly the mystery of the world or the beauty of the world has come to meet him, right? Or somebody hears the babbling of water or the waves coming in, on the beach. And that there's a part of us that got transformed. And then the part of us that for thousands of millennia, thousands and thousands of years, asked those questions and had that experience, says, where does that come from? What that's all about, becomes, right, the God archetype, something transcendent. We have those transcendent aspects. But Jung was careful to always make sure that you knew how important physical, living, empirical experience. He always described himself as an empiricist. And for all the other mystical elements in his work, he says, okay, I am into those. I'm not negating those either. That would be stupid. But I am also still very much an empiricist. And I think that's to his credit.
So it makes sense to me, this thing about the archetypes coming from this idea of ancestral trauma and also from life experience. But it brings me to a question that I keep on having myself. And I brought it up on the group a few times about this idea of fate versus free will. And so I'm just thinking about, like, in terms of the archetype, how much of the archetype that we embody sort of unconsciously is to do with fate, even. And what is fate? Because I'm looking at Manly P. Hall at the moment. I'm ready to listen to the next part, but have you got any ideas on that, on what is fate versus free will?
Well, this is another really key area, because remember, this will tie into the whole idiotic debate that they have between free will and determinism, right? And there's the philosophical answer, and then there's the psychological answer. And I think that Jung does a good job at answering it, right? And that is, although one couldn't understand it unless you did know about the archetypes. So this is, again, quite advanced level. You can't, this wouldn't be for a beginner. you'd have to know about his archetypes, right? And the way to look at it, though, in brief, is that the archetypes are so powerful, so important in our lives as constituents of the psyche, that they even control matter. So a particular lesson or a particular challenge that you're not wanting to face, because of these ego defenses or other, will come back to you in what we call fate, right? So in many ways, and the shadow works like this as well, right? But it's like especially if you're not facing something, Jung would harp on that he thought that if you were resisting a particular, message from the psyche, no matter how small, and what the hell, some of them are small, but they're small, a grain of sand can be small, but you can feel irritating in the shoe, right? So, he's saying that then somehow, now this has to do with mystical ideas, more mystical ideas, where he is like George Berkeley, the Irish idealist, is saying that, look, we're actually in a thought. There isn't anything material. That is a thought. The idea that you think there's a material, concrete world out there is a kind of thinking, exactly as the other side of thinking says, no, there isn't. It's all derivative of ideas. That's where idealism comes in, but it's a bad word. It should be ideaism. So then you come and you say, wow, this is a bit idealistic of, Jung. And, the argument goes like, he's saying, you're not in a material universe anywhere. You're in a thinking biosphere, which is the thought of spirit in the true sense. And therefore, since materialism is just a concretization of this, a very poor, unworked person's account of it all, and there's plenty of those around, right? So once you understand that it's all the psyche, you're in the psyche is not in you, then there comes this incredible activity where the constituents of your own psyche, the archetypes, actually have a kind of magical power, if you will, over fate. And so you then have this, you will then find that history and your own life takes on a quality that is numinous, right? In which things happen to you and people come into your lives. And I'm a huge believer in that, right? That you can study particular people's lives and biographies in which any concept that is just random chance, of certain things happening just is obliterated. And, and that's a more of a detailed study, right? Which I've done. And I can prove that this is all what it's about. But then Jung and astrology would be another way, of proving that. But Jung just said, your fate is your character, meaning that the constituents of your character, your own sensitivity towards those archetypes, whether you're a good student or a bad student, and some people are very bad students. So in some way, you can't learn from within, so then the lesson must come through another person. Aren't the archetypes in other people as well? So there's a sort of a collective aspect. That's why I call it the collective unconscious. And somewhere in the middle of that, what we call reality is also in many ways responsive in ways that still need to be studied. And if we had been listening to Bergson and, the holon theorists or the holographic theorists, we'd be able to study it with a lot more clarity and understand it. But we've still got this materialistic nonsense, from the highest ivory towers being taught to kids and taught to the students. So the very science, that we have to help Jung to bring out what Jung was saying, we're not studying, anymore. But, we dip into that quite regularly, actually. And we're going to be doing on this Sunday, another one on the frauds of materialism, hoping to bring out these other sciences that I think Jung, help us to understand what Jung was talking about.
You mentioned that the archetypes are racial. So does this mean that we need to be mindful of our heritage in order to understand the self?
Hugely so. I can't emphasize that enough, even though it's a very taboo subject, and only so much can be said publicly about it because of the nature of the times we're in. But hugely so. The Western man needs to study his Western archetypes. You've got a mother and a father, right? And that's it. They're your first culture. They're your first world, right? And then and even if they're from a mixed cultural background, you need to study those cultures. You have to, Irish on one side, something else on the other. Yeah, that's your culture. So this isn't any racist statement in that sense. It's a statement clearly backing up what Jung had also reiterated time and time again. And that is that all people, in order to come into contact with their archetypes, as their archetypes actually are, that means not keep on coming back to them like we do to God, gimme more stuff. but with a deeper inquiry, a deeper synergy, a deeper love, and a deeper care of the archetypes themselves. These are inner beings that you must relate with. And you don't relate to them by just coming and shaking them down for more goodies so you can run back into the world and be a better person or better intellect or whatever it may be. They're definitely giving. But, you know, who are they? You know, so, and this is where the racial thing comes in a lot, because these are phylogenetic, you know, things that even words that have become taboo. These are racial memory. We already said that it's about experiences from the world accumulated and crystallized over time, like a snowball effect. Yes, it is. But it also seems to run along racial lines as well, but for obvious freaking reasons, right? And so if you really want to know what your archetypes are, and this doesn't mean dismissing any other race. I'm telling the other race, people of other races, to go and do the same thing in their life, right? So it's not about superiorities, it's inferiorities. It's about a person needing, by definition, and this was the way things were up until, you know, very late in the day, to go back and be one with their own traditions. And also, I'm not saying that all those traditions are positive. So this is where, you know, you just go, oh my God, you're going to be thrown into a dungeon and haven't said anything wrong at all. I'm saying that those traditions are full of aberrant aspects, but that's part of it. That's the shadow of, you know, your collective group. So, and look at the horrors of Christianity, what it's done through time. Look at the lies that spread in the Bible, you know, the filthy sexism and racism and all the rest of that. The whole of it, just utter lies of the supernaturalism and whatever else that people like William Blake tried to fight all their life. But in general, yeah, you have to have a racial component. There was nothing wrong with that. It was considered completely normal up until these recent political times. And I do that, right? So people can, you know, be as offended as they like by that, but that's just the way it is.
It's going to become harder and harder for people to do that because, I mean, I think you're probably mixed race. I'm also mixed race. So as, you know, time goes on with like mass immigration and stuff, it's going to be harder and harder as like cultures are becoming more and more diluted, aren't they, with mass immigration? But it's going to be harder for people to do that.
But you pick, then at the next step would then be to pick a kind of tradition, you know, which you relate with, you know, so my mother was you know, Indo-European, their side of the family, and then the other side of the family was as well. Neither of those people could give a flying fuck about anything we're talking about here, right? So I chose the Indo-European, you know, Celtic, pre-Celtic, Teutonic, Nordic, right? So you don't have to actually have your parents and your own blood sort of, you know, be the guide, but you can pick a kind of a, you see, it boils down to language again, an archetypal language. And so you can pick a language, say like you get into Japanese stuff because you love the martial arts, right? It's all going to boil back to the same thing because it's all tea in different cups. It's all about which access road do I take back to a dialogue with the archetypes. And so for somebody can be learning Sanskrit, right? For somebody can be working with the runes. And they can be fucking Chinese for all I care, right? You know what I mean? And this happens. There's Western people who go to the I Ching. So yeah, when it's not a strictly clear racial, you know, backstory, then you are up into the point of choosing one, you know, out of these ones, and as long as it's authentic. And I'm all for that too. Okay.
You say that the archetypes serve the imperial self, but if the imperial self, there's a conflict if the ego and the self want two different things. So what can we do in that situation? And why are the needs of the ego in opposition to the self anyway? What is this defense? Why is the ego so defensive? And what is it trying to defend?
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? Well, there's two things, and then we'll add a third. One is the ancestral trauma. That's where all of this architecture of defensiveness came in the first place. And that's just my opinion.
Right.
I try to back it up with what Velikovsky said, you know, with Julian Jaynes, but they're quite inadequate, and I'm just using them to sort of substantiate, because you need it, right? People come along and go, "Where are you getting all these ideas, Michael? They sound kind of crazy." So it's you have to be honor bound to say, well, here's a couple of people with the PhDs that you need so much, right? Let me put you in the direction of you know, the top people, right? And then they get it. Then they go, oh, well, it's okay now. They don't care about the idea. They care about the, you know, the letters at the end of your name. If you don't have them, you're wearing a heavy metal T-shirt, you're automatically ignorant, right? Well, that's it. You're up against that. But the thing is that the next thing we pointed out and highlighted was your ontogenetic trauma, right? So the defenses come in, And in this case, the super ego then would be the big defensor, right? It's the ego defense that's got the real muscles to say, here's what you're going to be, here's what you're not, here's what you're going to repress, here's what you're going to allow into your character. And we understand this very clearly when we understand something that is not pointed out in psychology, but should be. And that is repression, the organ of repressing legitimate characteristics of yourself into the shadow realm, is oppression. It's just a synonym for oppression. So this now changes everything we know. So that when these social justice warriors and other people, even well-meaning, libertarians and liberals, are running around looking at worldly oppression, you can run around like Tweedledum and Tweedledee forever trying to put out fires of the physical oppression, and nothing will get done because you haven't understood repression, right? So psychology trumps all the others, but so very few people are into that. So the ego has created the super ego. The super ego came along as even a more, the ego wasn't defensive enough. Even with all its defenses, it wasn't defensive enough. So along comes the super ego. In neuroscience, it's really the left brain complex, right? It's the left brain complex, but the super ego gives us so much good for the evil that it does, and the left brain gives us so much good that we put up with it, the elephant in the room, right? The kind of lucidity that the left brain gives us over, it's like a bird, right? The bird is able to pick up its food and eat the worm, or find in the millions of little stones, it can find a little bug, but it's always looking around, right, for the predator. So this extreme telescopic ability to really come up very close to the canvas of life is so enthralling, so ecstatic, and so productive on a practical level. We need it. Boy, do we need it. So therefore, we live with this monster that we really don't ultimately like. And then it has got so much power now, like a tyrant, like some horrible, horrible tyrant that's moved in, who bloody starts dictating all these other things, like busts into your room and says, I'm going to move all the furniture around, and change the color scheme. And you go, well, you give me so much, okay. And then your colors are all pink, and you have to sit for the rest of your life in this god-awful, decor, because the superego said, I bought the paints, I've done all the work, how dare you complain? Yeah, but it's my place, shut up. Right? So we have a tyrant now. That's why. And it's called the left brain. This is not to say that the right brain is wholly good as well. Oh, we just need to, then we would just have a lobotomy and amputate the left brain and we'll all be back in paradise again.
That'd be good.
I don't mean that. Although there's a case for that, believe it or not. There's in the next installment of my idealism program, I'll be dealing with this, because there's actually people who did have that happen. Their left brain was entirely crushed, by an accident, or in some other way deeply impaired, and they were walking around like having religious experiences all day long. And they actually go and do talks on it. So part 5 will go into all of this, where they are champions of the fact they help. In other words, what they do is they help to, substantiate this idea that the left brain is the inner tyrant, right? It's a whole thing we're going to get into. But the thing is that then the ego created the super ego, and the super ego is just the biggest tyrant. And it has decided who we're going to be. And then the third element that I get into to explain that is in all the dragon mother stuff. And that is the role of the mother as a parent, is another reason that then strengthens constitutionally the super ego. And I'm only talking here about a phenomenon known as the terrible mother, and then what I call matrophobia, and the dragon fight that takes place with her. And that fight utterly transforms a person's psyche for the worst, right? And I focus more on the daughter relationship with the mother, for the simple reason that the daughter goes on to be the next mother. So, I just happen to, it just would be too digressive to talk about boys. And also a lot of what's said applies to the boys anyway, right? When you get into the mother-daughter thing, Electra complex, as Jung called it, what the hell, it appeals to the Oedipus complex anyway, right? But because girls go on to be the next lot of mothers, my God, I thought, how come people are not dealing with this, right? So if a daughter grows up with a necrophilous, devouring, castrating mother, which many, many, many girls do, then that mother is going to undermine their identity, their will, creating a deep rivalry, which I call the dragon fight, right? I think then that the damage to the psyche and the damage to all these repressed parts, the legitimate parts of the self, is so critical, so dangerous, that it will definitely then affect the socio-political, climate. And I think it does. And by the way, it's a very old thing. If you go back and look at the Demeter Persephone myth and decode it based on the dragon fight, it's all there. And it's also there in a lot of other Celtic myths, you know, and whatever. It's there in mythology from going way, way, way back. Medea, right? I mean, you've got it all over the place. Juno and Hera being these tyrannical mothers, you know, very, very evil. So just on the most basic level, let me just point out one phenomena that will go wrong. There's hundreds of them, right? But one thing that goes wrong in the dragon fight is that the daughter's vision of the male world is distorted from before the Oedipal period, and then up to the end of the Oedipal period, which is 7 years of age. So if the daughter loses this dragon fight, then one of the consequences of it is a deeply distorted view of the masculine patriarchal world. So she will not be able to integrate into it correctly, and she'll become a deviant and a delinquent. That's how dangerous it is. If there's anything to add to that, which there is, you know, there's millions of distortions. Well, one of them was the repression of the rage. Remember we just said that the repression of your legitimate emotions takes place. And my work is just about to give women, you know, all I was trying to do with Dragon Mother and Adultism is to provide tools for women to know about this, that this has been going on, and to get something, you know, to do, to process and act, to, what's the word I'm looking for, is to, you know, access and process and exercise this revulsion and rage. In other words, the matrophobia. To know that matrophobia is a legitimate subject, and to bring it to the fore, no matter how controversial that is, you know, so then that the woman will not project that onto males, nor onto her male children, nor will she breed a daughter who'll just carry on the horrid cycle of it all, right? You know, because the ultimate goal of all of this is to not reach reality principle. If the terrible mother wins, then the child, even though they may be physically entering, you know, they may grow up old, you know, they pass through their puberty, grow up to adulthood, and enter the solar world, they're really not there emotionally. So they haven't really come out of the pleasure principle. And we know what that means for civilization. It's total catastrophe.
Yeah, so I saw this. I've read most of Dragon Mother, and also looked into the Female Illuminati group that you have. And I have to say, when I first looked into it, I'll be really honest, when I first looked into the Female Illuminati group, there was some resistance from me at first, because it was a new concept for me, and I was looking into it thinking, is this just like a sort of women bashing kind of thing? But I trust your work, so I gave it some time, and I started thinking about what this really means, and what I can kind of deduce from it is that I know that there is this thing about the kind of entitled princess syndrome. So I've seen this myself, and it's in the court system. So like if a husband and wife split up, then the wife gets everything. She gets all the money, she gets the house, she gets the kids, she gets to say whether or not the father sees the children and all this kind of stuff. So and also in my own life, I know that I was most definitely the kind of identified with this idea that I'm this kind of poor woman that needs to be looked after by a man. And this was a very long time ago. It's very kind of early on in my life, so I can identify with that. I can see the darker side of the female psychology, which I think is what you're trying to show. And it's really important. But I'm just saying that, I mean, for me there was some resistance, and I suggest that I'm quite an open-minded person. But it's something that I think would take some time for people to really kind of integrate those ideas. But they are really, really important, because we need to know about, you know, the truth of what's really happening in society with both men and women. But even for myself, there was some resistance.
There will be from everyone in the human race. The female Illuminati is completely new.
Yeah.
I expect a lot of problems with, you know, I've had that all my life. It lessens as a problem when people realize you're under attack, and that women are under attack by this group as well. Just because they happen to be a coterie of, you know, extremely advanced, they're really royals, right? Royal female dragon sisters, or they're members of the dragon court, right? They're attacking women as much as they're attacking men. So that immediately clears the field for battle.
Are you talking about the ultra-feminist movement? Is that what you're?
No.
Sorry.
No, I'm talking about you're talking about the female Illuminati, right?
Oh, right, I see.
The female Illuminati is an actual, you know, secret society that has an enormous effect on our world. They're basically, they are behind socialism. I bring this out in the Black Nobility. They were socialistic back at the time of Jesus. It's a family, right? They're Persian, Jewish. They converted to Judaism, so they're really not Jews. This is where people go wildly wrong. They're actually Persian. Think of this, right? but they're not even Persian. They're Gnostic. They're something else. They're quasi-Egyptian. They're Atnists. They're Atnasetians. We're dealing with some heavy-duty crap here, really evil people. But in some bizarre way, they created they became liberalistic, what we would now use as the word liberalistic, during their times. You know, and this was, they only did it. They only did it to get the throne of the emperors of Rome, because they actually qualified, right? The sons actually were claimants of the Roman throne. So we don't want to get into all of that. But they became liberalistic, and then all of our history is the fighting between two groups, right? They call themselves the fourth sect. And the fifth sect we know all too well, that's papal Christianity, the Vatican style. Mm-hmm. So the fourth and fifth sect, over time in the late 19th century and then moving into the 20th, they're like that. They find, in other words, the fourth sect basically now won, and the fifth sect is no more. We would know that as right-wing, conservative, papist. They're crazy too, right? One is as bad as the other, but now they've completely come together. So the Female Illuminati won, and I tell that story in my other works, right? But then, because they were liberalistic, once they won in the 20th century, then we have the rise of socialism. So by 1917, you have what? Communism. And they had a little bit proto-communistic nonsense, you know, before. But it culminated, everybody knows, in communism. And we've got it today in this ultra-socialism, this radical socialism, anarchism and all. It's the same money behind it. George Soros is just a conduit, just a little lower henchman, a puppet for some extremely powerful people. And these Googles and all, you know, they're owned by all of these types, as almost everything is. So there's that thing to bear in mind. But the field is easily cleared once we understand that these are the destroyers of Western civilization. Well, they're destroyers anyway, right? Their liberalism is, you know, an occult liberalism, because they're basically orgiastic Dionysian types, right? Whose whole religious outlook is very different than ours. They're nihilists. They're people who don't really ultimately believe there is any supernatural realm or any, that's the wrong word to use. Let's just put it this way. They don't believe that there's any inherent meaning in life except having pleasure, you know, and we can get into all of that stuff as well. But yeah, because they're made up of these very, very powerful women, men are deeply involved as their agents. So I'm not making any sexist statement there. Half the agents who execute, you know, like these Adam Weishaps and others, these are all men. So I'm not splitting them off and saying it's only some evil witches out there, you know, doing something. No, no, no. They're a very small group. And their agents are the black nobility, you know, of the world. And then the black nobility then co-opt a lot of other lesser people through the Masonic structure who have no idea what the symbols mean or what's up above them at all. They're not meant to know, and they don't know. So that's really, really important. But
Michael, where are we headed? Where do you think we're headed with all this information? With all this knowledge?
The future is not good, because remember, all chaos on a socio-political level is born out of the lack of psychological insight. Right? So it's like your previous question. Where do we go if, say, matrophobia is not dealt with, if women don't get the tools to heal themselves by accessing all of this, you know, content to become whole human beings again? Then they're going to run in the streets. That inner tension. See, look, even though those defense, we've spoken mostly about the defense mechanisms that suppress legitimate feeling, right? Mm-hmm. And they work expertly well. So you've got one kind of psychology that's to deal with the problem of those defense mechanisms. But then there's a whole other psychology, separate school, that says, what happens if we don't unseat those forces of, those mechanisms of oppression within? You know, the master-slave relationship. Before it's found outside, you know, it goes within, right? Mm-hmm. What do we do then with it? What will happen, right? So there's a kind of a crossover between psychology and sociology, in which we see what happens. That although these methods or systems of repression do their job beautifully, the underlying tensions remain. You know, the mechanisms aren't concerned that the real problems has just been pushed below the level of consciousness, the alignment of consciousness. But that means that the turbulence, the PTSD, the parapsychological, the parasympathetic systems, your very fibers and nerves are in a state of agitation. So if I'm not able to process it legitimately, I will then amplify my unrest, my angst, by getting into a crowd. So we're going to have more crowd consciousness. And the crowd does other things as well. For instance, it's like it amplifies your will to power. It gives you a sense of will to power temporarily. You know, it makes you feel bigger than you are. It amplifies a lot of negativity, right? And then there's another way of saying this, which was the key theme to the 4 or 5 programs that you talked about. And that is that what you're really happening now, and this answers your question, I think, very importantly, if you're coming strictly from a Jungian point of view, and that is that when you continually don't access these hidden aspects of yourself, in other words, the shadow realm, you don't work with it in a positive way, you force all the archetypes to return in a daemonic form. And you can either use the spelling D-A-E, monic, or D-E-I, it doesn't matter, right? Because even the word itself is really rather imperfect. It just means that they come back in a raw, brutalistic form. And they're right to do that because you've treated them in a way that is so censored, that is so ugly, right? That they'll return in an ugly way because they're all agents of the self. And so we went into 5 programs elaborating on that, right? Because then what will happen is now that your inner republic is in chaos and the archetypes are, like an Alice in Wonderland mad kitchen, just chucking salt and pepper at each other and screaming at the top of their voices, you listen to me, no, you listen to me, right? It'll make you neurotic as people are becoming more and more neurotic. And then as you become more and more neurotic, you end up becoming more and more psychotic. And then after that, there's a new sense of, what happens in a person like this is that there's a new level of dissociation. Right? One that wasn't there before or only there slightly. Now it gets more teeth, and that's what self-deceptiveness and dissociation and the superego sort of ramping up, right, to even be more oppressive toward you, causing even then more, of the same issue. And I think then that this is where crowd consciousness then, oh yeah, and another thing that we forgot to mention, which ties into this, in the consequence of the dragon mother fight, is that we forgot to mention is autophobia. That if you lose by 7 years of age, if you've lost the fight and the mother has successfully, entrained you with her will dominates, and all your rage and all your revulsion is suppressed. 2 things happen which are instrumental to all this. It would be very, very, very wrong to not mention them. And one is that the child, in order to lessen all of that tension, one of the first mechanisms of doing so, which shapes our world, is identification with the tyrant. So the child finds in this catch-22 situation that in order to lessen this voice of utter rage and disturbance and feeling of unrest, and also to get along with the tyrant, you start identifying with the ways of the tyrant. Maybe they're right. I really do love that power she's wielding. Wow, she's so powerful in Medusa. And oh my goodness, love that. Look at those big boots that's stamped all over my ego. Wow. So you start to you become psychotic. You become aberrant. You start identifying with the power of the bloody tyrant. But as soon as you do that, and that's where the superego is born, we get the superego from identification with tyranny. So when you see these snowflakes running in the street speaking freedom, empowerment, that is all that type is exactly the type we're describing now, because they have to run in the street because they've identified with tyranny, and then in a massive desire to self-deceive that is the case, they have to make the lady doth protest too much. So loud bullhorn statements are made to deceive themselves that they're all enslaved by tyranny, but I must make sure that I dye my hair pink, wear the Venus logo, march in crowds crusading for the opposite, so I can look to all intents and purposes that I'm not who I really am. And that's why socialism will work. That is why it is always the organ of oppression. But then when the superego comes into existence, and we've just explained how, immediately the consequence is self-hate, autophobia. So the self-hating syndrome is where we're going. Unless you do the shadow work, the archetypes will make it even so that this is the dynamic, and that you'll just be drenched in self-guilt, guilt and shame for rebellion. So when all these people see these snowflakes, apparently rebelling, don't be fooled. They're not rebelling, and don't get caught up in it either. It's all inauthentic. All those people are crying for is the decoration of their inauthentic life. They're not crying for real freedom, real liberty, really save the trees, let everybody open all the borders, let everybody be free, get down with government, all these anarchistic, protestations, all of this crusading. It's all lies. It's based in massive acts of self-deception. Go to the Dragon Mother site or read the books that you've read. If your members are interested in looking into this more. And of course, the whole healthy process of dealing with your archetypes breaks down.
Can I ask you, with regard to the dragon fight, do you think that it can be won at any time? Because you said about at the age of 7, if it goes past the age of 7, then quite frankly, you're screwed. But do you think that is it a case of cutting the apron strings and kind of building on autonomy and not identifying with the mother anymore and noticing the things about her that have influenced you in a negative way? Is this winning the dragon fight, and can you do it at any time, is my question.
Well, the dragon fight starts in the womb. So it's one of the hardest things that can be done, which is why people choose all these other modes we're talking about, not psychology, because of the difficulty. Right? It starts in the conditions in the womb. And even when you say that, like, what does that mean? Sure, the child isn't even thinking in the womb. It's not about that. It's about processing all organisms through mirror neurons, mirror what's happening around them, even the single cell organism. Why does it come out to grab a bit of food and then go back into it, shrinks at that exact moment? I could have done it all day. It just does it now, and you know the light is different, or this is different. There's so much sensitization in our system. So what's really happening with the fetus is that it's registering the mother's self-conversation. So if the mother is a constitutional psychological inferior, right? If she's necrophilous, devouring, etc., or has been deeply traumatized in her life, which is usually what has happened, the whole thing is going to, you know, start from that point. And she may be using the child then as a kind of accessory, having such a very low self-esteem. You have, you know, your children screaming and yelling in public places and dressed up in all sort of weirdness to say, look at me, look at me. It's the mother saying, look at me. That's all it is. Or she uses some sort of psychological crutch. And all that's going to happen is that the dragon fight is just going to continue and continue and continue because you're dealing with unenlightened people. And as we said, she becomes the tyrant that one identifies with. So how can you break that? Do you realize the stoical process, the insight, the deep years of aloneness to take on this thing that your whole being wants to dissociate from? You've identified with a bloody tyrant, which is already aberrant. So now the actual process is de-identifying with the tyrant in order to even begin the process of discovering the whole other thing. We're already, you know, way down the line. And we're not helped by our superego. Because you see, this process that we're talking about now, which is real shadow work, let's make that tie. We've been talking broadly. Let's really connect this now. The dealing with metrophobia, right, and the electro complex is shadow work. This is not being told to you by a lot of people. And it involves the body. So you won't be able to sit in that cubicle under those fluorescent lights, you know, for 10 hours a day trying to get that promotion. If you're dealing with this shadow work, it's not going to be possible because the processes you're going through are going to be timeless. So you're not going to be able to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, get that coffee and rush off to work. That's all going to break down. Are you willing? Are you ready for that? Talking to a bunch of gormless people at work with no psychological insight. Are you going to be, or even in a marriage, for fuck's sake, right? We're in the shit. So no, people don't want to deal with it.
No, they don't.
But the superego. So then you know what happens? You ask about the future, more big pharma, because you're not dealing with the real thing. And so this tension is building up, and you'll need to join the crowd to run around, you know, to scream and yell, to try in some way exorcise it. That's how the reign of terror started. That's how all acts of you know, street insurgency begin. A bunch of constitutional inferiors, morally and psychologically, running amok, trying to pretend they're not what they really are. And all they're doing is instantiating the greatest Orwellian boot that they'll ever, and then they'll be satisfied. They don't even realize they're building the bricks for the greatest dystopia to come down on their heads as a kind of a new super ego, so to speak. But in the meantime, when they find out that this isn't working, you know, when the individual members of the crowd, this isn't working to ameliorate their state of being, and they certainly don't want to do the shadow work, then they turn to the drugs, legitimate and other. And so you have big pharma, right? Then you have overeating. Then you have, you know, addiction and the consumerism, and finally world revolution. They'll burn. Just read about the reign of terror. How when these maniacs weren't throwing bombs in amongst crowds of women and children, they started scarifying themselves. They let or some idiot, these people tie themselves to the gates of an institution with a bomb in their pocket and blow themselves up. The police are arriving and going, what the hell is this now? I'm waiting for that. I'm waiting for cannibalism in the streets. Because once you've rejected the reality principle, nothing, no one, no voice of sanity or reason can stop these morons from running around and doing exactly this. The Islamic fuckers are already doing it. And you're going to have people living in the West, these socialistic types, plunging us backwards. The Midwelt becomes so poisoned by people who haven't won the dragon fight, who haven't gone through the shadow work. The Midwelt, our society itself, becomes so degenerate and poisoned by these toxic types that it just implodes back into, you know, whatever, the lunar abyss. So this is what comes. This is why I've always, in my work, you see, I'm the only one in this entire alt field who's ever called, you know, from day one for the use, for the necessity of psychology. So that these universal contagions of feminism and whatever else will emerge from it, you know, because all these Bernie Sanders and all these people are absolutely psychotic, right? And they're collectivistic to an incredible degree, and they're gonna bring down Western civilization if we're not careful. But the thing is to find out who is the enemy, what weapons are they using, and then what we can do about it in a proactive way.
So just to clarify, you know, with the Dragon Mother fight, do you think that can it be won after the age of 7? Because I haven't read all of your books, so I didn't get to that bit. So can you
Oh yeah, by listening to the work I've put out, my whole life has been dedicated to going into deeply into this. Of course it can be. It's already kind of happening, right? Look at MGTOW, for instance, right? MGTOW is a pathetic attempt to win the fight over women who have grown up and not broken the dragon fight. Remember I said that the male world will be distorted in a woman's eyes by the dragon fight?
Yeah.
Well, part of that distortion, to unpack it a bit for just a second, and that is that when women who have been so castrated by their mothers go into the solar world, because they have to, you have to matriculate, go to school, marry, all the rest, but you're carrying with you all this hatred towards the mother that you deflect and project onto men. Then what you do is you create a kind of man in your children and in the male world. The men of the world are forced to, they're molded into the shape of what I call the chivalric type.
Mm-hmm.
It's not natural to men to be like this, but the chivalric type is this monstrosity that is produced by a toxic femininity. What has happened with MGTOW is that game is up. So after hundreds and hundreds of years, the chivalric mode, you know, in which men have conformed to, is now playing itself out, and men are not interested in it anymore. So what we're seeing now is one of those reactions toward, I'm hearing a noise in the background.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. My phone has never rung before, but it's ringing right now.
Okay, no worries. I just wondered what it was.
Yeah, well, I just turn it off now.
Okay.
Very sorry about that, Michael. It's actually never rung before.
I was just wondering what it was. So yeah, the age of the chivalric male is changing, and women aren't going to like it. So that will cause a third thing that, you know, who can predict, right? MGTOW is all I see with MGTOW is low-level criticism of stereotypical women. You know, women are bitches. They haven't got much further than that. They know nothing, zero about the psychology that creates those types of women. Nor do they understand that they, as men, before they got the MGTOW, were a chivalric man, which is a preposterous creature to begin with. They never self-critique themselves. So that's useless, right? Right. The chivalric male is a compromise for a certain kind of female that has not won the dragon fight. These things, you know, one links to the other.
And how is he created then? Is he created because of his own mother? Because of his own mother has crushed his own will? And
women in general that he meets. Right. When you're in school, you realize, oh, they want alpha males, or they want this kind of man, or whatever, or the media is telling women they want. So the man eventually molds. He doesn't realize it, you know, but he hits Gold's Gym, and he's a jogger, and he's a, you know, wears the medallion, you know, and all this crap, right? All these imagos are based in something aberrant. That's why, you know, it doesn't work. That's why you don't have relationships working anymore and all of these things, right? But it takes two hands to clap, right? They've been watching too many fucking James Bond films and whatever, right? And they've lost what true authentic masculinity is. And we went into this in the Angels and Archetypes podcast, where I talked about the 4 imagos that, you know, women are attracted to or not attracted to, as the case may be, just to point this out, to emphasize that. So the masculine then is dragged into a, you know, it becomes emasculated. The chivalric man is a preposterous Frankenstein creature who doesn't understand what authentic masculinity is. And so we now have a feminization across the board that's going to hurt women and men. So that's another aspect of it as well, right? I think on some very, very pure level, you know, there's a sort of a body aspect to this, but it's not the Reichian version. right? You know, this workout culture and all of this, which is meant to be identified with masculinity. Now that it just doesn't work. You know, and really the way to see it is that both the male and the female are victims of the master slave. The parents instantiate it and then you interject it. And so your whole life, you know, women's bulimia or anorexia, a lot of other syndromes that they have, you know, even the ones who are putting, you know, earrings through their noses and all the rest of it and living under bridges, it's all comes from the same electrocomplex, you know, the matrophobia. And the remedy is psychoanalysis. Now, a 7-year-old can't read Jung and Freud and understand it. So, you know, but maybe a 14-year-old could. So it's going to be that your puberty is reliving a lot of this. And then you have from puberty to the 20s, you know, if your parents, if you're just very, very lucky, you know, you'll be able to maybe start, you know, primer material, read the Erich Fromms, read the Arno Gruens, you know, and all the people that I recommend over and over again until people are sick listening to it. But there's a reason for that, you know. But to answer your question properly, if we don't get into psychology in the healthy way, because there's a lot of people into pop psychology, that doesn't work, then I'm afraid we're back to Julian James's premise, which is after all of the social crusading, the feminism will get to a point where everything will just collapse. The entire middle will just collapse into a lunar abyss. And we'll be back to the bicameral period, which I touched on earlier, in which the only way that you hold psyche together is by the instructional voice of a massively supernaturalized voice in the head, or more likely what Orwell and Huxley were talking about, which we will finally then, as the Soros types want, we're actually, everything we're doing, we're playing into their hands of Big Brother, because they know that the full result of the demasculinization of the world will mean that the only thing that can hold the psyche together will be the cry for living under the shadow of a bestial, you know, Big Brother dystopia, the likes of which we've never seen. So when all these people are running around with their placards screaming about freedom and emancipation, I shudder, because they're going to get the exact opposite, because there's not an ounce of rationality in anything what they're talking about.
So shadow work could really be an antidote to a regressive society then. It really could, couldn't it?
Yeah.
It's really what we need.
And one other way to escape the tragedy of coming out of a relationship like that with your mother or your father, right? The whole horror of it is humor and comedy. Laugh at them, right? Laugh at the whole mess. Don't bury yourself in depression, because that is the only other alternative. You've got to somehow get into something that, you know, you can almost laugh at it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, you know, become the fool again. All cycles open with this lightness, you know, because you're going to move on to the Arthur Road after this, and you're going to gain incredible psychological insight. You're going to free yourself from all of the misleaders who hate truth, hate wisdom, hate themselves, right? The misosophy. They hate wisdom and truth. You don't. So when you pick up those books that people like me recommend, you're doing it with a love, not an impatience. You're doing it saying, thank you, the Aladdin cave is open to me now. And when I say laughter, I mean laugh at the fact that everybody's insane, that everybody's mad, that everybody's lost. It's a big carnival. It's a big nightmare, but you have to separate yourself from it, you see? And in doing that, you have to have the mentality of an outsider. He's crying for them at the same time, but he's also laughing at their nonsense and their stupidity and saying, look, you know, you can't trap me with that anymore. You know, I'm on a great project here. And during that, and you know, we're going to be doing it on Sunday. This also is an attitude you must take even with the greatest in the land, not just with the politicians and their Punch and Judy shows and their idiotic, you know, histrionics, but the science, the materialistic science with their concepts of selfhood and subjectivity. You know, we're going to be going into that on Sunday. So there's a lot of ways to, you know, break the collective in your life and be okay. Mm-hmm. But see, the process is made harder, right? Because there is no silence. There is no peace. There is no aloneness anymore. There are things that definitely compromise this, right? But again, that's the work of trying to find a way around that for yourself. You know, there really is no easy way, you know, and again, that's the reason why a lot of people don't bother with it. Mm-hmm.
Michael, the last question I've got for you is one from one of the members, and it was regarding the rites of passage. So Joseph Campbell says that we've lost a myth in our lives, and the old rites of passage are gone. So what was once the rite of passage into manhood doesn't exist anymore. So do you think that we need to recreate rites of passages? So just to kind of mark maybe our individuation journey, our dragon fight one. Do you think that that would be useful? Do you think that
Yes.
ritual still has a place?
Oh, it's happening anyway. Yeah, you don't invent rites of passage; they occur anyhow. If we had choice over it by will, we wouldn't have any of them, because again, we'd knock it all out. Luckily, there's a flow. Let's not even talk about the Hegelian flow at the very base of reality, but the mythic flow that just underlies our stereotypical existence. And tarot, astrology, Kabbalah, numerology, they give you the insights into being sensitized to know a bit about that, right? That's beautiful. And yes, those are the rites of passage. Once you start getting understanding, you realize, oh yeah, there's 7, there's 12, there's 26, or whatever, you get to know them and you get to understand how to predict when they're coming up. And this is then to articulate yourself to a much deeper flow, basically in Jungian terms, and that's being guided by the archetypes, right? When they say the 12 houses, they're talking about the 12 archetypes. When they're talking about the 10 or 11 spheres on the tree of life, they're the archetypes, right? And they manifest as different voices, different directives, but personalism is essential here, because the revelations that you will have are completely unique to you. It's like, imagine you walking into a physical Aladdin's cave. The things that attract you as being beautiful and wonderful, that you want to grab and look at and fondle, right? Another person may go, I don't like emeralds, I love these rubies instead, right? So that's fine, isn't it? Or somebody likes gold, others like silver. But the main thing is that the journey has begun. The adventure has begun, and you're never going to rely on the culture that we're in now, especially with the control of the architects of control and where it's going, this ultra feminization. So you have to pick up the slack on your own, and realize that. And again, realize what we just read from Freud and from feeling is a key part of this. And so the one thing we haven't mentioned here about getting in touch with the archetypes is art and aesthetics. You mentioned dream journals and things like that, or even dreams. You see, okay, let's back up a bit just to answer this properly. One thing we did not mention too deeply, or I think we did, yeah. In the process of getting in touch with the deeper emotions, it's soma. They're actually contained in the body. So then you have a Janovian, right, Reichian idea of that I must not just remember or think about what happened to me in my youth or at any given time, or yesterday when they were still doing it, right? These parents or whatever, but I must feel as I felt back then. Right. So Arthur Janov is saying, I have a psychotherapy that's different than Jung and different than Freud and different than all the rest of them, because I'm not interested in putting you on a couch to hear you talk about what happened. I want you to lie on this couch and in a bioenergetic way, awaken, and that's stimulated also through bioenergetic therapy, as everyone knows. I'm just reiterating what a lot of your listeners already know. But in that stimulation of the body, you awaken the feeling. This is crucial. You'll only awaken it a bit. We're not talking about completely diving into what you felt like, right? But the shame that you felt of, how dare they affront my ego? How dare, did she do that? My mother, my father, or those people, who the hell was this that came in and told me, I'm this and I'm that. So you try to awaken the emotions as well. And that's what he thought the true catharsis was, right? And this will also then involve the awakening of a deeper sensitized feeling. So that basically wraps that up, is that the sensitization is never going to be deep. The way I described it before, it's never going to be deep unless you are in fact exercising these issues of the past and bringing up the feeling, not the memory. That's real psychotherapy's difference. Because then what you're doing is you're opening now access to the right brain. And then you now can experience the wholeness, which makes the Siddhartha road less lonely, less painful. Once you are articulated to the greater wholeness of which you're looking, right? Which is not the same as oneness, by the way. This wholeness that you're intuiting and that the right brain preserves is then the little pack on the fool's back, that he's carrying, that has the treasures, that will never leave you alone. That sense of greater, but that cannot be thought about. It's too little to be thought about. It's too great, right? It can only be felt. And art is essential here, because art is the way that you also then commune with the feeling body and the right brain. In other words, you bypass the censor. Yeah. Language, words, metaphor is much more of the left brain. Art and music, poetry, and so on is more of the right brain. So again, this is going to challenge you, because now you're going to say, I don't want to live in the city anymore under this noise and chaos. I'm going to have to move to the countryside, or at least nearby it. Well, your partner may go, no, you're not. I don't want that. I love this apartment, the flat ground and the concrete and the steel. It's so convenient. Look at our lovely parking spot. So, you know, that's the end of that. All of what we're talking about is a major challenge today in society. And there's despair either way. But you see, there's legitimate despair by your attempts to live the authentic life. And then there's the terrible existential shame of living the inauthentic life. And again, you'll soon find a pink hat and a placard and run around with all those other snowflakes going, decorate my inauthenticity, big brother. I'm really pissed with you. Don't you know I've come to the end of my sensations? And you guys you have the audacity to not keep me perpetually stimulated with more TV and more sex bots and more whatever you're going to produce. Get on with it. You know, so one idiot hears them saying, freedom, we want freedom for the oppressed. And the psychologically empowered person, which I hope, you know, our audience is all like that, is saying, oh my God, look at what we're dealing with here. These are suckers. They're not creators or co-creators. These are failures. These are fucking losers. And one look at their rotten bodies, you know, and the rest of it, and you can see and all the things that they call for, right? Or utterly, see, it's like in China, the glyph, right? The hieroglyphic for crisis is made of two glyphs, and one is danger and the other is opportunity.
Ah, that's interesting.
Brought together. So crisis means a breakthrough. We would say it today by saying there's no failure is not a failure is not failure. It's a challenge to get up and move to the next step. And our archetypes really, you know, there's a warrior archetype in us, right? So what needs to happen now to counterbalance the feminization is ultra masculinization. The MGTOW is a really rather pathetic attempt at that, right? It's just chivalric men who haven't really done any psychological homework, you know, hoping for the best that their type can lead us out of, you know, whatever chaos we're in. No, not really. They're 1/10 on the field, but you're going to need a lot more than that, you know. You need to awaken the direction back to the archetypes. But in most people, as our series talked about, the archetypes have become daemonic. So we now have another problem, right? We're dealing not with wholesome archetypes who've ever been listened to, but we've got, you know, shadow archetypes who've come back in a very malignant form, who are not necessarily directing us to the will to meaning. So it sort of, you know, your question about whether it can be solved or not is a very problematic one. And I think the answer is no, unless people get into, you know, a lot of the authors that I mentioned and some of the studies that I mentioned. You know, they'll be locked into relativism, they'll be locked into scientism, and most of them in a sense of exhaustion will just head back to the church and to religion, hoping that will, you know, provide them with a panacea of alleviation to this terrible, terrible anxiety that they're feeling inside, you know. So yeah, it's a, you know, I just got on with the work that I have to do from a vocational point of view. I don't look to outcomes. I do what I do now purely because it's of meaning and it's of significance now, you know. But so I don't focus too many on outcomes necessarily, you know. That's just a characteristic flaw that I have. I just deal with what I'm doing now because of the love of it, you know.
Can I ask you what's the difference between demonic and daemonic?
Oh, demonic without the A. There's really, to me, there's no connection between the two, although demonic has become, you know, in the religious sense, an evil thing. But since religion itself is evil, any definitions that it has of other evil things kind of fails right there. You'd almost want to look twice at something religion calls evil. You know, they think that heathenism and paganism and the night sky and, you know, whatever, the earth, the whole planet Earth is evil. So much for their definition. So you just throw those definitions out. And the word actually then comes alive, like so many other words do. It was used by the Greeks to mean demonic and angelic. But I like it better because they also meant it in terms of a very physical thing. Daemonic is similar to chthonic, right? A word called chthonic, which means earthy. You know, it smells of the earth. It smells of your roots. And we know that Jung also would have smiled on that word because of the simple fact that his archetypes were of the roots. They were of the earth. There's something that locks you into the world as is. And when you want to reset your psyche, you know, what we're all talking about right now here is a kind of a resetting. You push the reset button, the reboot button, and everything's cleaned off. All the lies, all the mysteria, things that couldn't possibly be, but you've made come to be because of false teachers. You know, and most of its religion is mostly Gnostic, so all of it can be thrown out. Most Eastern philosophies can be thrown out, they're Gnostic. You know, and so Hermetic, coming back to the Hermetic truths and precepts is where we need to go. That's why I'm a big in favor of the Western magical tradition. And I've been panned for that. How can you be into tarot and astrology? You're a shill, or you're one of the Rosicrucians, or you're a Mason. It's like, dude, before these institutions even could spell their own name, these subjects were in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The Hermetic subjects were in the world from thousands of years before Masonry ever came together, or some other boogaloo Western group got hold of it. So I'm talking about, the purest disciplines and the real mystery schools. And you know something? I think that psychology, for all its flaws, and there are big arguments about, for it's against it, right? But even with all of them, because of what it is, like we talked about earlier, because it is matriculation, it's understanding of the self. And again, I'll finish on that, is like, if you have no self-understanding, then the whole Hegelian thing about how you could possibly understand another breaks down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So can I just clarify that with the daemonic archetype? Would I be right in thinking that it could be something that's kind of numinous, but in a sort of negative or challenging way? Would that be? With that, does that sound right, or have I got it wrong?
The archetypes are numinous, because what happens is, just like it is with certain dreams, right? Because we have a collective unconscious, a great deal of what we may dream about or even think about is pretty much thought of by everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
It has a sharing. There's definitely a bleed over between where there's no uniqueness, right? And these are then homogenous kind of experiences, like all our sexual wish fulfillments, right? That would classify there. But then there's a deeper, like I said, as you go along this Siddhartha road and you get more and more in touch with these archetypes, it starts to become more idiosyncratic. Their communication with you leads you into fields that other people haven't experienced, right? And that's when sometimes, like the Jakob Boehms and all, the William Blakes, you have to shut the door, and what the world does or doesn't do now is it becomes unimportant. Or only very, very secondary. And that's where his great art, you see, would have come from idiosyncratic expressions that, even though they seem to refer to figures I know, like, God looks like God, or Adam looks like Adam, and the serpent's there. But then there's other weird stuff that doesn't make sense. Yeah, because that was coming from his own expression. Mm-hmm. So the ultimate end of shadow work is to open up the deeper doors, not just this sort of therapeutic stuff of healing. That's all great and everything, but you realize that's just clearing the leaves away from the door. That's just, putting some oil on the hinges. You haven't even gone into the second chamber yet. The real hermetic place is when you do this is all just deconstructive, getting what mama said and dad said about me and the world thinks and some political nonsense, right? Once that's all shed away and you're the true poet and you're opening up those doors, then you become, right? This is where Escher was, and Blake, and the great authors and musicians. This is where they're at, to different degrees, right? And you can regress and you can go, and it's always going to be an oscillating process. That's why the magician wears that symbol above his head of the lemniscate. There's regression and progression, right? There's stasis, and all of that is okay, right? Our society is one that is really sort of a stasis. They try to build some constituents of a society and then stay right within that. As we said, habituation. The real spontaneity when you follow this even further down the line. And you're leaving all the familiar. Then you're into a numinous world in which the symbols that come to you don't have the same meaning as they did for the collective. So, for instance, say that somebody was having weird experiences where the archetypes were coming to them in animal form. Mm-hmm. This would be perfectly okay, because they are animal. They're of the earth. So there's nothing wrong with that at all. But a person who's been brought up as a Christian is going to freak the fuck out, right? When some horned satyr appears in a dream, or in some other mode, or you're drawing and you keep wanting to draw this horned face, right? And you're losing sleep and you're ready to sign yourself into the funny farm, and one day a neighbor comes over, oh, that's Herne the Hunter, that's the Green Man, lovely, very nice. And suddenly you're going, oh my God, is that all it is? I was like, or suddenly
that does seem to be most people's paths. And we know when they get into shadow work, they go through this whole stage of like this magic happens where they start having synchronicity, they start looking into their dreams, all this kind of thing. It's like when you notice the unseen kind of starts to notice you as well, and then you enter into this like sort of numinous world. It's funny how that happens, isn't it? What do you think that really is? Do you think that's just maybe imagination?
Oh, it's totally the imagination. If we enlarge, as long as we allow for now what we think of that word to be enlarged to incorporate all the feeling and thinking I was talking about. This is when it's not so much that you are embracing the spirit, but you're allowing the spirit to embrace you. You know, in a sense that now, you, like Jung, you understand that the whole universe is psyche, and that you're just one constellation of reality, or a very important one, right? But there's some other kind of awareness that takes place, and art will lead you there, because art is already teaching you to embrace in, you know, in that way, but also to allow yourself to be embraced, to have wonder about what you've just created, right? That, you know, I didn't, like when you pick up an instrument and you play it and something comes out, you go, my God, I didn't even think of that. Is this the instrument did it or whatever, you know? So there's a wonder. You need to be continually refreshed by wonder and awe and astonishment at the universe and its complexity, right? And then the next step is to go and express it in some way. But then the absolute apotheosis of that is when you, at this point, you cease asking any other external force to explain those numinous experiences. It's really numinous when you are the font of it, and you are also the explainer of it. No chronicle, no holy book, no expert. You know, it doesn't matter what they say about that symbol that comes to you. In the early infantile stages, you know, and it's perfectly okay at that point to say, well, a ladder, I keep seeing this ladder. Or no, I keep seeing this big phallic thing, you know, floating around. I mean, what's all that about? Am I crazy? Right? Or I keep, you know, I keep seeing the goddess and everything, right? Every time I look at something outside in nature, I keep seeing female forms. I'm going crazy, right? You know, in the clouds or whatever, right? It might be. And it can even be things that are a little bit more disturbing as well. It's okay, right? There's a lot of things going on. And then at that point, you'll turn around to experts like Jung, right? And like Joseph Campbell and others, Mircea Eliade, right? And whoever. And they can be very, very helpful to explain, well, no, this is this is a thing of transition. You know, the horse, the mare, it can be frightening, but it's really about you moving from one dimension to the other and all the other stuff we're going. In the beginning, that's important. But the numinous is when suddenly you find that you're not even inclined to turn to any external force for the interpretation. The experience is somewhat powerful, more I would say, but now you are so engaged with it that you let it sort of flow over you without needing for interpretation. And this is a very, very important point, because now the left brain structures of needing, you know, what is it about? What is it? It's because you're still dealing with metaphor. You're still allowing the left brain to come in and go, well, it's like this. Yeah, but that's still separated from the thing. If it's like it, it's not it. You're still giving me metaphors. The whole numinous thing is when no such process is involved, and the experience is raw, and it's intense, and it's in that way, and is no longer being interpreted, right? This is the key word. Right up to a certain point, you're interpreting what your own mind is doing, what is happening, you know. So yeah, you look at the canvas, you've just said, wonder what that means. Is that my childhood? You know, is that my dad? Right? And then you're interpreting. And you know, at some point you realize that that's a lot of bollocks as well. A point comes, because then I can interpret it anyway. A point comes when there's just one-to-one raw experience, not just externally, but within, right? And that is what to me is really numinous. That's just my opinion now. You know, it could be different for everybody. But now you will say, it is what it is. I need no interpretive, you know, there'll always be descriptiveness and interpret. It's the way the brain works. It's never going to be completely gone, but you're no longer listening to that. It's somehow you're just in the moment of, and that involves all experiences that happen. And so people will call those, oh, that was more intense. I didn't, you know, when I was having that romance or whatever, I didn't get into all this mental stuff. Is she thinking of me? What's she thinking? Was I good enough? You know, all that nonsense, right? That all goes out the window, and you're just like, it was perfect. I don't even think of dissecting it, right? It's like the way animals are when you have a relationship with an animal, right? We experience this sort of merging and this kind of a numinous experience with animals. Yeah. Where you're not fucking analyzing it, right? Or you're just experiencing it in a very, very, very big way. And then I believe that this is what is really needed in the archetypal journey. When the archetype is no longer sort of having to instruct you like some formulaic teacher with a clipboard. That's okay in the beginning, you know, in the beginning. But there's another type of journey that happens with your archetype or archetypes. And I think this was what also in the Arthurian legend you get. you know, and I think this is what some of the other myths, when you get this wandering in the desert, you know, the concept of he's just wandering, he's not actually going anywhere. In many, many, many myths, you'll get this, where there's a moment of, well, the warrior has donned the garb of the fool. It's like Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. He's considered the ranger. That's what I mean. He's a fucking king, right? But he's lost that garb. Or like Gandalf the Grey is different than Gandalf the White. Mm-hmm. So there's a moment in which you're just the wanderer, blowing smoke rings and wandering around in the swamps and camping out near the fires. Yet you're a powerful being, right? Mm-hmm. You're a very, very powerful being. But there's a moment when you just sort of wander, you know, and for Tolkien, this wandering, all who wander are not lost.
Right. Okay.
And believe me, that's numinous. Mm-hmm. That's you coming out of the cave and into the cave and out of the cave again, right? It's a different sort of numinousness. And certainly you're not asking anybody to frame your reality for you. And you even release the archetype from having to explain and explain and explain, and then put them in the role of a tutor. Mm-hmm. Right now, when the anima comes to you and the animus is there with you, it's of a different comportment altogether. And then a whole other story of cosmos, of universe, of self can unfold. And that's to me is the numinous.
Right, you just mentioned anima and animus, and I'd be doing myself a disservice if I didn't ask you about how you say that we should integrate anima and animus. It's quite a big ask at this stage.
Oh no, these are the essentials. The very fact that somebody is asking it is of vital importance. Well, you see, it's like the shadow work is first, because the shadow is merely the emissary of the anima, and the anima is only the emissary of the self. Right? The animus, who's masculine, is more the force that helps you deal with external reality. The anima is the one who guides you on the inner journey, right? And you won't even get to that journey without dealing with the shadow work first. They're like the chains that hold you from the archetypal realm, right? We're in the stereotypical realm, right? And one of the reasons why millions of people live and exist in history and die without understanding that there's an archetypal level beneath them. They experience war, they experience poverty, success. I got the job, I had a baby, I had a child, I'm married, I had divorce. They go through all these experiences, which are rites of passage, and have no idea that they're connected to rites of passage. Brilliant, right? Because they don't have that sensitivity. Well, they're not going to have it because the archetypal realm that just sits below this, that's moving all the time, there is a wall between it. And that wall, right, won't disappear without the shadow work. So you're chained to the stereotypical. You're actually chained there. And we kind of know it on some level. It's our frustration. I want to do more. I want to be better. I want to be somebody, right? I want to create. Yes, that's it. But until there's a flow, you know, a percolation up from the archetypal, you'll never find your destiny. So the great work is that. Part of the great work is to immediately become sensitive to the archetypes. And as I said, the divination arts, you know, they help as well. And getting into even physical art and certainly working with the body, that's key. Then after you start to get sensitized to the archetypal, now the anima says, good, the fool has learned lesson 1. And then she will come, you know, in a way that now says, all right, we're going to the next level. And then a journey can begin. So that is not possible without doing the shadow work first. And, you know, and then once you've done it, then a different kind of sensitization opens up, and now you can hear that voice. Mm-hmm. You know, and then part of that journey is, of course, Jung tried to extrapolate it, you know, with a lot of different ways, you know, in terms of the 4 types, right, and bringing them to balance. So there's even a structure in all of that, right, because the anima will talk to you through one of 4 different types that you have. It can come rationally, it can come through feeling, it can come through intuition, it can come through sensation. And Jung had to complicate it by telling you that it might come through what's known as the repressed, right, function. You know, that's probably not the right word. It's the least conscious function. 3 are conscious. 1 is very conscious and 2 others to support. And then there's this repressed one that's way out in the unconscious. It's still out there like a, you know, I always liken it like a space station with nobody on it, floating out there in the nether. And one day a light, it gets turned on, you know, and then you start to feel it coming in. So there's that to bear in mind as well. It's a whole other conversation about that. But let's just keep it simple for now and say that the anima is going to appear through one of 4 doors and lead you. And it can be a mightily unearthing, devastating experience. You'll see this in the movie with Jeff Bridges called Fearless,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in other ways as well. You know, you might even see it in the Tolkien thing, right? With you know, them having to leave the Shire. But I'd say Fearless is even, you know, much more articulate. But there's many other films as well that go into this. And it's at this point then that the numinous quality will probably increase. There are numinous things from before, but they're going to be very far and few between. It's only when you come into contact with the anima and begin the journey that the numinous thing is really going to, you know, take over, so to speak, you know. And yeah, that could lead you to awakening different physical talents that you've never had before. It'll certainly demand that you change your lifestyle in multiple ways, you know, and all the rest of it. Pay attention to nature and animals and things that you never thought of before. So it can take all sorts of forms.
Okay. Okay, the last question I have for you is about manifestation. So manifestation seems to be a big kind of buzzword as well within the sort of New Age movement. And in my own experience, I know that when I knew this before when I was completely unconscious, that when I think of something, I can direct things by thought. Not completely, not always, I can't control all of my future like that, but there are some parts of thought that are really kind of shaping for my future, I think, anyway. So I just wanted to find out what your take on that is.
Yeah, to me, that's a hard one, you know, because remember, yeah, this is huge. I'll be dealing with it in a forthcoming book on existentialism, and it's about whether or not we did cover it in Path of the Fool, right? But in that show, it was articulated this way, and that is there really a goal, true spiritual goals or true whatever goals, you know, on the path that we take, or are those just illusions? And is it the need to just feel, you know, the cobbles under the horse's foot and the wind in our hair and the experience and exhilaration? And then we pretend that there's actually, you know, a trophy at the end. And it's the same in this. In my need to manifest, is that legitimate and good? Or in my effort of manifesting, am I actually blocking another kind of manifestation that's already taking place? So this is in German, the term letting be. They even have it in the East, in Japan, you know, where it's more referred to as Wu Wei. But they have it in German philosophy, mystical philosophy. And that's just letting a thing be. So there is the imposition of the human will to manifest. And I believe that that occurs. So this is where it's difficult to decide because both exist. And then there's the more stoical way of completely pulling back and not interfering.
Well, you know, this brings me back to this idea that I keep coming back to about free will versus fate. So I think that I need to spend some time doing a bit of reading and research into this, because this is, you know, me asking you this question has just kind of brought me back to that again.
Well, see, remember, we are already the product of manifestation, right? And it's certainly true that what we think changes the world, right? And when you're working with the archetypes, your ability to manifest is highly accented, right? Although it may take the form of, well, all right, let's frame it in the way that I normally do. Not only is this whole thing we're talking about holy work, it is also extremely about psychic sovereignty, right? And one of the other reasons why things are happening in the world today, why religion is still so powerful, why political histrionics and hysteria is the order of the day, is because nobody has the faintest idea what evil really is. It's the missing part of the curriculum, right? When you upgrade any kind of insight, it's going to be insight that has this reinforcement, this sovereignty involved, in which you become very, very aware of what is foul, what is, you know, evil in yourself and in others. And so this is all this was going to be massively upgraded, this insight, with working with the archetypes, right? So what I would say to that is that now, because you are able to really see what is pestilential and toxic and poisonous in the world or in other people, you are going to have now greater demands, you know, on who you hang around with, where you live, and on you know, how you know, in other words, your relationship with time and your own productivity. and how many distractions there are and all of this, right? So manifestation is also strangely born out of this ability to exclude, right? And become certain of what is your priority. Without that, I don't think the word has much currency, right? Manifestation is a very physical thing. It's talking about what you have up here, the incredible art of saying, what's an idea in my head, insubstantial, and then saying, here's a product, here's an actual thing that's created. That is a tremendous, study, and it has a lot to do with archetypes. It has a lot to do with, the whole manifestation. But see, what use is the manifestation if it's not really idiosyncratic to you? If it's just generic stuff. What you want in manifestation is you want to have something that really speaks of your identity and your will and your existence here. We call that vocational. But the archetypes are only interested in vocation. Really, they're the constituents of your own being. Why ask them for something that's generic? They won't supply it anyway, right? So when a person comes to say, who am, those gateway questions, who am I, where am I going, how did I get here, where am I, all that. Those are the gateway questions that are eternal through life. And they're the questions that perk up the archetypes. They want to answer those for you. They want to lead you to the answers. And art and creativity and manifestation, right, are gigantic affirmations of that. Like, I think when somebody becomes more creative, that is their affirmation that you're on the right track. What could be more than that when you want to sit and write and you want to sit and paint and you want to sit and create and you become obsessed with it, right? You know what I mean? And you just want to build that out and be part of your vocation and do it regardless of what anybody says. I think that's a commitment, to your own psychology. And it can take many, many forms. And the more numinous it becomes, the less you need anybody else's approval. You don't abandon it altogether, because then you're some sort of kook who just wants to do things on your own and you're the judge of it. No. There's still an element of the world's, statements or whatever, but it's not approval that's eclipsed your own sense of being. Right? They can approve and they can disapprove, and you'll cordially and stoically take on board what somebody else says, and you may even still be, mimicking somebody else or inspired by somebody else. Of course, all of that's going to still exist. I'm not talking about somebody who becomes autistic, where the world doesn't exist. But what happens now is that the world's approval is no longer eclipsing your identity. Where, oh my God, they don't approve, change, which everybody's doing right now. It's all just a jostling to fall in with some bizarre socialized image of what a person should be, a man and a woman, or some other hybrid in between. The thing has gone completely derailed, right?
My goodness, and don't we have quite a few hybrids at the moment? You don't know what to say. You just don't know what to say about it. But listen, thank you so much, Michael, for taking the time to speak to me today. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure that my listeners are the people on my group, Awaken with Shadow Work, will really appreciate it as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks. And definitely we'll have you back on Enslaved as well. And we should further explore this, because no one person is the expert in any of this. We're all unfolding this together. This is the most extraordinary thing. And since it's just such a deep love of mine and a great need to, deal with evil, what I've come to find out what I think evil is. And I absolutely think that it will be solved through through psychology and no other form. The rest is just tinkering about, moving furniture around on the Titanic. Only psychology will get to the roots of evil instead of thrashing around at the branches. But again, Caroline, thanks a lot. It's been very good. I was really looking forward to this as well. And I hope it came out great. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michael.